Welcome to Illuminate Universe's podcast, The Cast. Get it? The Cast? Okay, let's dive right in. My name is Cindy Jano, and I'm a project manager intern at Illuminate Universe. In this episode of Illuminate Universe's podcast, Illuminate's Director of Business Development, Rochelle Knightlet, and Brandon, Illuminate Leadership Academy student, interview Chowdhury, who is a cyber risk advisory analyst at Deloitte. Listeners this week will enjoy hearing advice that MASH has for students both starting university and leaving university ready to start their professional careers. They'll learn about the increasing importance of leadership skills in the workplace and recommendations for managing a proper work-life balance. Before further ado, let's get into today's podcast.
So, Mash, welcome to the cast. We're really excited to have you here. Let's get started and jump into our first question. Rochelle, why don't you start us off?
Sure. So, Mash, I thought we would go back to the beginning of your journey. When you were going into university, did you already know what you wanted to do? And then what did you study? And how did your post-secondary program decision relate back to those original goals?
Got it. Perfect. So it started off with me just when I think I was 16, I was super excited with cybersecurity. Less on the corporate side, of course, because I didn't understand any of it. But I was just excited about, hacking Facebook or hacking Google or things like that. So I'm originally from Bangladesh. So I'm actually an international student. So looked up some great universities in Toronto and Canada and America as well. And then I realized that York University was offering specialized honors in computer security, which is what I graduated from. And so I just hopped on a plane and got right here to Canada. So a lot of the things that I learned in that course did tie back in with my goals, because now I wasn't just able to be excited about, let's say, hacking a certain thing, which is highly illegal unless you have signed consent, but also how does it truly help companies and individuals, right? So that's how I married my ambition with a corporate job, essentially. Yeah.
Yeah. And, you talk about your experience as an international student. Do you think in any way, traveling halfway across the world from Bangladesh to Canada, that your goals might have changed in any way?
They became more practical and realistic, yes. Yeah, because the environment back home is very, very different from Canada, right? So definitely got more realistic and more grounded in reality.
Yeah, for sure. As much as we try to set clear plans for ourselves, things do not always pan out as expected. Especially now when COVID has pretty much thrown everything out the window. What advice do you have for students who are going into university and university students going into their careers?
So this is a fantastic question. And I actually have the book right here. I actually wanted to show this to you guys. So this is called The Fourth Industrial Revolution. There we go. And the reason I showed this book is because one of the key things to remember about any kinds of courses or any kinds of degrees that we go for, whether it's a diploma, an undergrad, etc., is that the key is in predicting the future, right? So, visionaries like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, so Jeff being the person behind Amazon and Elon being the guy tweeting about crypto and also the founder of Tesla and SpaceX, these people didn't just sit down at a table and ask themselves, how can I learn something that'll keep me fed for 24 hours? They ask themselves, how can I do something that'll keep me going and that'll change the way we operate, right? So they look 5-10 years ahead. So to answer your question, Brandon, the key is to ground ourselves in technologies and careers that would be useful 5-10 years from now. And the number one way of doing that is by reading and listening to people who are already accomplishing great things, right? That's my first piece of advice. The second thing, which I was looking at a few minutes back, is don't be overconfident. That's something I had to learn the hard way. My personality used to be that, very cocky, very overconfident. I would walk into a room thinking I'm like something else. But then as you go through university, you always realize that there's literally always someone smarter than you in the same room. Even when you think you're the smartest, you're probably not. So my piece of advice would be, ask yourself what's ahead. Look at folks, so men and women who are accomplishing great things in strange arenas or strange industries, and then ask yourself, okay, this is what I want to do. This is what's going to be used in the future. Is there a career path at a college or a university that marries the two together nicely, right? And the last piece of advice I would add to that is you're not limited and you're not capped by what you study in school. Being in cybersecurity, and I've looked at over 100 LinkedIn profiles, kind of creepy, but it's a fact, right? I've looked at 100 LinkedIn profiles of everyone from CISOs to managers to directors to founders. And it's never that one person stays in cyber for the rest of their life. Some people come in from random industries, and some people stay in cyber for all their lives, right? But it's good advice that just because you studied something in school doesn't mean you'll always stay in it. And it doesn't mean you can't be better in another field, right? We're hyper capable. We just have to realize it soon enough. That's all.
You know what's actually really crazy? The first point that you brought up about how Industry 4.0 and kind of grounding yourself in like technology that's going to be used 5-10 years from the future is actually what our entire case competition was entirely written about, which is actually a crazy coincidence. We talked all about, Industry 4.0 technologies like AI and how these technologies are going to be so quintessential moving forward, and kind of using this and reeling it back to our conference's main idea of social entrepreneurship and using these technologies as a vessel for social change, which is absolutely crazy. Yeah, that's really great advice that you're giving.
The piece that stood out to me was that you said you used to be the guy in the room who would walk in feeling really confident.
Yeah. Overconfident. Yeah.
Overconfident. And I think that in developing leadership skills, a lot of that is demonstrating humility and a sense of just being humble. And it's interesting to hear that you didn't necessarily start out that way.
Oh, no. Yeah, absolutely.
I'm wondering, as leadership capabilities are becoming more and more important in various industries, do you think people are born leaders, or is leadership something that can be cultivated, learned, developed through time?
And Brandon, this is another great coincidence because 2 days ago, I just shared a LinkedIn post from Stephen Schwartzman, who's the CEO of Blackstone Group. And what actually happened, Rochelle, is that image that I shared on LinkedIn literally said, great leaders are made, not born, right? So this podcast was meant to be. So the straight cut answer is they're made. Humility is a very difficult pill for me to swallow, still is, and I think it will be for a while. The way I look at leadership is, at my job, for example, I never look, so I'm an analyst, right? That's after you are an intern. I believe that's the most entry level full-time position you can get, at least within my team in Canada for Deloitte. I never look at my title when my manager gives me like a piece of work or he gives me like a deliverable. I never look at my title and say, I'm an analyst. I shall only do part A, B, and C. So leadership comes in when you kind of set your title aside and worry more about, it's going to sound a cliche, but it is true. How can you make the lives of people around you better? Whether it's your close friends, your family, or in this podcast context, your colleagues and the other students within your class, right? And that is extremely important because leadership is born essentially out of truly caring. And it's very, very difficult because in today's world, people are getting more and more isolated now thanks to COVID, but also people are getting more and more selfish. So it's very difficult to be selfless in a world that rewards being selfish. Like it's extremely difficult. But leadership comes from truly caring and asking yourself, how can you make the next person's life better? And this applies everywhere in our lives, personal, school, as well as work. And later on, when we talk more about careers and whatnot, I'll give an example as well.
It's funny you mentioned this because Rochelle and I were actually just in a leadership call just 30 minutes ago, and we were talking about how what we think is the most important skill for a leader is actually empathy. The most effective leaders is actually caring for others and, caring for their teams and caring for their employees, caring for the world, especially when we talk about the context of social entrepreneurship. Empathy is what drives the entire industry, right? Starting companies to fight malaria, dementia, all these just stem from the core concept of, caring for others, empathy.
Yeah. Yeah.
So really.
Yeah. And just 100% agree, Brandon. And it's really understanding where the other person's coming from. And again, it's just so difficult sometimes, right? Which is really difficult to relate to people most of the times, but it's taking that extra step to touch base, the favorite consulting keywords, touch base and circle back. but do you really care? Really, really need to care. Yeah.
And that's funny that you say that, because that's also a topic that we've talked about at Illuminate, how great leaders ask great questions and how people can tell when you genuinely care about what you're asking
Mm.
versus just
Yep.
asking for the sake of it. So
100%. Yeah. 100%. Yep.
all of that ties back into those like fundamental leadership skills.
Agreed. Yeah.
And we talk about leadership skills and, being the most effective leader you can be. And we talk about your job as an analyst at Deloitte. It's a very competitive process. So what do you think it was to set you apart from the other candidates? And what do you think young business leaders like myself, all the other regional leads of Illuminate can do to set themselves apart from the other young business leaders that are also very impressive in their own schools and careers as well?
So I really hope my manager is listening to this. And here's why. So when I was at York University, I told my friends that I am going to get into Deloitte, right? And literally everyone thought I was mad. People were saying, Mash, it's a competitive environment. You need to apply to more companies. Lots of applicants. You won't make it. I kind of ignored all of them. My eyes were always set on Deloitte. So I was obsessed with getting in. Why? Is because I wanted to help clients make their lives better. That was my true intention years before getting into any kind of job, to be honest, right? So what I did, and this is straight coming from me, I'm going to give it to you straight, no shiny stuff. It was very hard, not because of the application process, but what happened preceding that. So I started technically applying a year before I even graduated. What I mean by that is I started meeting with managers, spectacular managers, senior managers, consultants, trying to get on calls with these consultants, meeting people at the actual Deloitte office. Why? Is because I really wanted to understand what makes these guys special. So I'm not trying to kind of put Deloitte on a pedestal, but I'm trying to get the idea across that to really work somewhere, you need to understand their culture. And that doesn't just happen when you read their website. Like, you will never understand culture reading 2 paragraphs. It just doesn't work. You need to feel it, right? So I sat down with these managers and I looked at, okay, how do they explain their issues? What kind of questions do they ask? What are they interested in? So the takeaway from my story is, before you aim to get into any kind of consulting industry, investment banking, whatever, you really need to get in touch with the individuals inside to understand how they're like. You do that 4 or 5 times, it's gonna slowly get into you. And then the application process becomes just a formality. And of course, an approval process as well. But if there were 2 things that I could give as advice, the first one, I believe, I think it's the intimidation factor. So an embarrassing story for myself, when I was preparing for a cybersecurity competition at Cybos, which is like a global conference for the banking payment system today, I was so embarrassed, right? And I was so intimidated by these coaches at the presentation. Man, I walk in, there's 4 or 5 people from RBC, like a director at RBC, a director here, a director there, and there are coaches. I was so intimidated. One of the coaches, who's a director, was speaking to another girl. And for some reason, I was so nervous, I started beeping. I started making weird noises with my face. And I still think to that till this day. And there's a reason, right? There's a reason I'm sharing this. It's because A, it was embarrassing as hell and funny. B, when you're intimidated, you don't ask your real question. You try to look smart, you try to look good. And I know because I've been there. When I get on a call with a partner at Deloitte, in the beginning, I used to be like, okay, I got to say the right things. I got to not look stupid. But if you're doing that all your life, especially while you're at the end of your school or your university or beginning, you're going to miss out on the connections that you build by asking honest questions that you really want to ask, whether it's that coffee chat virtual or coffee chat in person with your mask on, right? So number 1 is getting the intimidation factor out of your head. Number 2 is a keyword that's coined by people like in venture capital, is network effects. What network effects means is when one person uses a product, it makes it better for other people who use the product, regardless of whether it's a marketplace or a normal product. But it also applies to a real life, right? So going back to Rochelle and Brandon, both of your questions about leadership, right? When you're trying to make someone else's life better, they will remember that connection. And when they have a chance, they're going to talk about someone else with you, or they're going to talk to someone else about you. And that's what happened with me. Cybersecurity is a very small industry in Toronto. but I know a few players who know other players who've probably heard about me because I've been caring, actually contributing, and I didn't go walk into a conversation thinking, oh, if only I could get his recommendation. Oh, I really hope I get this job because I know him. Because the moment you walk into a conversation trying to take something away, as Rochelle pointed out, people can smell that from a mile away. They'll know you're just a small talk guy who wants a business card, wants a LinkedIn connection, and walks away. Low quality conversations, nothing comes out of those. Being your genuine self, exiting the intimidation in your head, and bringing your true self to the table, whether you're talking with your manager or your coworker or your friends, builds long-lasting relationships, as Ray Dalio puts it, and it builds very good relationships where you can exchange ideas for years, and it goes beyond just having a job, right? Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Absolutely. That's a ton of useful information for people who are not just in high school or graduating high school or
Yeah,
graduating university, but people who are also working in their careers.
absolutely.
All of that is always going to be relevant. And a big part of what I'm hearing is the people piece. So many companies are now circling back to that idea that it's the people who matter, whether they sell like whatever goods and services they sell. It's all about the people. And that's always going to be an important piece. So that ties in nicely to where I'm going with this. The people matter. The people are much more than just employees. It's interesting to hear how focused you were on Deloitte, on how that was very much your end goal. And now you are working at Deloitte. So that's awesome. We know that it can be very demanding though. So how do you maintain your work-life balance, or do you?
Sorry, work what? I haven't had that word in a minute. Work-la, what? So I'm a very straightforward person, very transparent. Work-life balance is never 50-50. It's 60-40, which becomes 40-60. It's 70-30, that becomes 30-70. What I mean by that, in getting away from consulting for a few minutes in my life, it just means there's not going to be 9 to 5s every day for the rest of your life if you're in consulting. I can guarantee you that. But there will be days when you're working past 5, maybe 7. There's days when things might just slow down and the day ends at 3 p.m. So how do I manage it? The frank answer is I've been learning to do that a little bit better these days myself, especially because of COVID. Because as you probably have realized, ever since COVID came into action, work from home became sleeping at work, right? So it feels like you're always working, right? So it's been very difficult for my personal self recently. But a key piece of advice there is when you're walking into, so I've heard from my friends in banking, but can't speak to it much. But in consulting, don't walk through the door thinking it's going to be 40 hours a week because you will be disappointed. Be ready to put in more. But a very key thing that I will personally say is, regardless of your position within the company, if you're an intern or an analyst like myself, don't be afraid to discuss it with your team leaders about what you're comfortable with. There's been times where I've had to take calls at 8 p.m. I had that conversation with my leadership and said, hey, love the project, love the team members. But given my current circumstances, it's a bit difficult to keep doing this for a longer period of time. And my leadership was kind enough and understanding enough to adjust accordingly, right? And I'm still working here. So the conversation went well. That would be my only piece of advice is set expectations, but do so in a respectful way from an early stage as much as you can. Work-life balance.
Work-life balance? What's that?
Work-life what?
I mean, cyber risk management is such a, it's a really challenging field, but it's still so rewarding, and especially again moving forward. Going back to Industry 4.0 tech, it's just going to be such a demand. There's going to be so much demand for cyber risk advisory and cyber risk consultants because we're very much in this sort of early stage of the internet, right? I mean, the internet's only been around for like 20, 25 years, where it's been like this sort of mainstream thing, right? Going into 100 years in the future, we're going to have a lot of data privacy issues, cybersecurity issues that really need a lot of cyber consultants to, sort of manage. And tying into that, do you think cyber risk management is a good field to enter for students right now? And how can students prepare for a career in cyber risk management?
Perfect. So cyber is always a very sexy field to be in. But Brandon, one of the things that you told me about is how cyber essentially marries STEM with business, right? And keeping that in mind, I'll say two things. Number one is that's very true. And because of that, there will always be demand for cybersecurity. It's like, as long as there will be buildings and people, they'll need to be protected. Just go out the door. Like there's police, at least I'm in downtown Toronto, there's police everywhere all the time. Okay. Cybersecurity is that, but digital. And as you mentioned, with changing landscapes for technology, innovative technologies that are being developed every year or so, right? These technologies need privacy and security built in from a design perspective, not as an afterthought, but something that needs to be there from the ground up. So cybersecurity is a fantastic place to be in. The only caveat though is it's not something you just pick up and go with. It's something that you really need to mentally prepare for. Like if you're not excited, if you don't get crazy nerdy about like security when people mention anything about tech, rethink if this is a field for you, right? And the reason I say that is because when my friends, let's say, talk about, them implementing like Google something for their family business, I'm already thinking, oh man, what controls do you have? What kind of access does your dad need? How many employees do you have? Do they need write access on all the repositories? But these questions are not because I went to York or because I studied a book on security. It's because I'm genuinely curious, right? So for anyone listening to this podcast, if you really want to consider cybersecurity as a career or for even a university, the first question you should ask yourself is, what gets you excited about protecting digital stuff? Say stuff because it's general, right? It's like, don't worry about corporate companies protecting their data. Ask yourself, does it get exciting for you that you want to protect your public CCTV from being accessed by a stranger? Are you excited? Great. What about your home computer? Are you excited? Okay. If the interest is natural, it's a great field to be in, but it takes, I believe, 3 to 4 years of committed work and committed learning to really get in the groove of cybersecurity. It's not just something you pick up in 2 years and just go with, right? There's a lot of money in this, but it comes with a lot of learning and a lot of empathy, rather, because you really have to care about what the other person's saying, because there's a lot of charlatans in this field. And LinkedIn is full of them. And I just scroll past them and just keep scrolling. Yeah.
Yeah, no comment about that. But, just as we end this sort of podcast, if there was one piece of advice you would give for any student that's, sort of dead set on going into cyber risk advisory, what would it be?
Be truly curious and don't bullshit yourself, right? And I know that's kind of like really strong wording, but it's a responsibility, man. Like when you're in cybersecurity, you're telling people how to protect their house. And a lot of people can easily bullshit their way through that. You're protecting systems, you're protecting organizations, people, actual people and their lives and their businesses and their health, right? Literally their health information. So if you're giving bad advice because you're in it for the money, someone else is going to get hit by a car, metaphorically speaking, and it's going to be on you. So it's not like riding a bike. Cybersecurity is a huge responsibility because you're literally like a policeman for the internet. So, with great power comes great responsibility. So be curious, but don't bullshit yourself if you really like cyber or not. That would be my only piece of advice. Wonderful advice to have.
Yeah, ending it with an Uncle Ben quote, very, very
I know, right?
But, it's very, I learned so much already, not only from this podcast, but from our discovery calls, from you and me chatting on LinkedIn and Gmail. Like it's been just such an amazing connection to have with you, because I feel like, you're a really genuine presence and you've given me so much advice already, not only for cyber risk consulting, which isn't a field that I'm personally going into, but, just for preparing me for my career in general. Thank you so much for participating on this podcast. I hope everybody that is listening took away some of the lessons that I learned as well. Yeah, but thank you so much, Mash. Thank you for answering these questions.
No worries, Brandon. No worries, Rochelle. Super, super, super grateful to be on the call.